a moment, I'll tell you some things about the Government Legal Department and life as an employed barrister with the government. We're waiting a colleague, Karen Squibb-Williams, who hopefully will join us shortly and talk about the work that she does. To my left we have Birgit Hagen, who is with the Crown Prosecution Service, and F.A.
Avenamayo.
Thank you.
Yes.
Who's the Financial Conduct Authority. And each of us will give you a brief oversight of the type of work we do. Hopefully at the end we'll have some time for questions and answers. I thought it might be interesting first of all to give some facts and figures. Many of you would have completed a questionnaire before you came here today, asking about the interests that you had, which particular types of practice you'd like to go into. And it was, I was amused to see that 746 respondents said that they want to go into commercial chancery. Well done all of you, that's a very good move, particularly if you're looking to pay off student loans and debts. Commercial chancery, fascinating work, very well remunerated. Then the next figure I saw was 667 people want to do crime. That's interesting because most people, when they talk about the bar, their image is run whole of the Bailey, appearing in front of juries and speaking at great length and convincing people to let murderers and other people like that off. Of course, they're all innocent. Then the next, and in fact the highest figure, was 783 people expressed an interest in public law, human rights and civil liberties. And that filled me with joy because I'm going to speak to you about the work that the Government Legal Department does. You may think the government is actually actively working against human rights and civil liberties, but that's far from the case, and the work of a government lawyer really touches upon all of those areas and public law. So in terms of how I came to be in the Government Legal Department, like many people, the people I mentioned in terms of crime, I wanted to appear in front of juries and do criminal trials. And as a consequence, I was very lucky. I actually had a pupillage with the Crown Prosecution Service many, many years ago, when their standards were far lower than they are now. I was very lucky and they took me on. And I worked there for many years. And then I was very fortunate to go to somewhere called the Attorney General's Office. Now, some of you may be aware that the Attorney General is the government's legal advisor. He's the chief law officer, and he provides advice to the government on all manner of things. And if you're interested in politics and government, being at the Attorney General's office as a lawyer is a fascinating and really great opportunity because at the Attorney General's office you get to see everything that goes on across government. I mean, really everything comes across the table, from the budget to work and pensions to the Ministry of Justice, international law. Of course, many of you will be familiar with the famous advice given by Lord Goldsmith in the context of the Iraq War. So it's a great place to work, and it's a really good example of how, as an employed barrister, you can be right at the centre of things and using the skills that you learn at bar school and in law to help persuade and advise some very senior people. So in the time I was at the Attorney General's office, I had the opportunity to advise the Home Secretary, Ministers of Justice, Number 10, on all manner of very odd things, some of which I can tell you about, some of which I can't. And the great thing about being at the Attorney General's office was that I still felt very much as if I was a lawyer. So although you were a civil servant, you were first and foremost a lawyer, and Birgit will tell you this as well. In the Crown Prosecution Service, when you're a prosecutor, your first duty is your professional duty. You're always a barrister first and foremost, and that guides everything that you do. So working in the Attorney General's office, that gave me an insight into a world beyond the criminal law. So I dealt with things like the law of contempt, some public law issues, civil rights issues, and international humanitarian law. And that meant that at times I was giving advice on the use of force overseas, the UN Charter, things to do with ships at sea, whether or not they could go where they wanted to go, all kinds of weird and esoteric subject matters. But it was fascinating, and what it led to was a post at the Home Office, where I now work in the Home Office Legal Advisors, and in that position I am in charge of the team that deals with policing, crime reduction and fire. Now that's pretty much everything it says on the tin. Policing, that's everything to do with policing, from their paying conditions to their pensions, which is not quite as interesting as some of the other stuff. Police and Criminal Evidence Act, public order policing, who can be the next commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, chief constables, their powers, all kinds of strange things. I found out the other day I'm responsible for advising on the police air service, which I didn't even know existed, but apparently I'm in charge of looking out for that. So really interesting role, and the kind of things you're looking for when you're advising in these subjects is around judicial reviews. So whenever a minister is asked to do something, the lawyers are always involved in terms of giving advice. Now sometimes there's not really very much for us to say, sometimes it's actually just a very political decision, but nearly always there's the potential that there will be a legal challenge. So we're always looking at how we prevent judicial reviews either being brought or being successful. And that means that we have to have awareness of a whole range of public law issues, particularly around subjects such as the Human Rights Act, the European Convention on Human Rights, what effect these things are going to do. Because you can imagine in the policing context in particular, there's lots of Article 8 issues, Article 11, sometimes Article 2, Article 3, prevention, prohibition on torture. So there's all kinds of interesting issues that we have to think about. And it's the lawyers that are right in the middle of the policy formulation and advising about how to, A, make a policy work, but B, to make it work in a way that's not going to be challenged in the courts. So when I was a prosecutor, when I was a prosecutor, I used to enforce the law, and it was great fun. Really enjoyed it, and you're going to hear about that very soon. But now, as a government lead lawyer, I find that I'm actually helping to make the law and shape the law, and it's a real privilege, and it's really fascinating, and it's very interesting. And other things that I advise on are UK drugs policies. Has anybody seen the business around legalising cannabis for medical use? That was my team. We spent the last 6 months trying to work out how we could do that in a way that was sensible but protected the public, but also allowed people to have access to medicines. I was involved in the Psychoactive Substances Act. I was the lawyer for that, what's called the bill lawyer, so I saw that all the way through Parliament. I could see that's the law that bans people from using nitrous oxide to get a high. It was particularly successful. As I was walking up past King's College, I saw loads of little canisters for nitrous oxide, so I'll have to feed that back to the police that they need to step up their act. But the great thing about that was I was involved in the policy, and I went to Parliament every day. I spoke to parliamentarians, spoke to ministers, and I helped advise them on how to make it as robust as possible. And also, as I said, fire, I look after that, anything to do with the fire service. So a real interesting range. And that's what happens in government legal service. You get to see all manner of things. Everything that happens in government, there will be a lawyer behind the scenes advising and assisting ministers and politicians and senior officials. Just before I finish, you're all here for a pupillage fair. You're all interested in getting pupillage, which I appreciate is one of the most difficult tasks that you're going to face in your career. I think life at the bar, both employed and self-employed, is excellent. It's one of the most interesting careers I think you can have. You see all manner of things, but it is difficult to get in. The Government Legal Department does offer a scheme for legal trainees. So in July 2019, we're going to be offering approximately 60 trainee solicitor and pupil barrister positions. We also pay, if you meet the test, we will pay sometimes for you to do bar finals. There's even the possibility for us to pay for you to do the graduate law diploma. I can't remember what it used to be called, something else in my day. Thank you. And that's a really great opportunity. So do look into it. We're on the website www.gov. If you type in Government Legal Department, you'll find all the details there. A word of warning, last year we had 3,800 applicants. But if you get through, you're going to know you're very good. So I'd encourage you all to think strongly about it. If you're interested in politics, law, government, they're the place to come. Thanks very much.
All right. So I'm probably the more junior person on this panel, so I might give you a little bit more from my side of the bench, as it were. I'm a senior Crown prosecutor at the moment in the Crown Prosecution Service. What you need to know about the CPS is that it is a 6,000 strong organisation that consists of lawyers, admin, business, victim support, a whole host of different individuals. It's big, and we deal with about 500,000 criminal cases a year, if I remember correctly. CPS is also national. Obviously, it also stretches to Wales. There are 14 different areas, with London split in two, simply because it is so big. So when it comes to scope of work, if you're interested in crime, the CPS will have it, or do it, or be involved in it in some way, shape or form. And what's pretty great about it is that, I'm presuming, because it's quite different where people are from, not everyone's interested in practicing in London. And the CPS gives quite a lot of great opportunity also outside of London. So I'd really recommend, if you're interested, to have a look at that. To tell you a little bit about how I ended up where I currently am, I joined the CPS also as a pupil. There had been a hiring freeze for 5 years, 6 years I think, in the CPS for legal trainees. That's pupils or trainee solicitors. That followed the financial crisis, so it was a delightful time to graduate from law school. Good times. But it also meant that we were new. People didn't quite remember what legal trainees were in the CPS, which was actually quite good, because it meant they said, "Hi, you're a pupil. What would you like to do with the next 12 months?" Which is quite fantastic. I spent my pupillage in London. I had a pupil supervisor who had been at the bar for 20 years and then decided to go in-house. She said, on my first day, she said, "You're an adult. This is what you make of it. This is your year. Let's figure out what you want out of it," which was, I don't think any of my sort of bar school graduate friends who were in at the self-employed bar ever got that option. So I looked around and I said, "Can I go to the homicide team for a while?" She's like, "Yeah, let's send you to homicide." "Can I go do extradition?" She's like, "Yeah, extradition." "Organised crime?" "Sure, we'll sign you up." And for 12 months I got to do any and all kinds of crime, which sounds always weird when I say that to people not in law, but it meant you could do everything. So my pupillage for the first 6 months, I went wherever I was interested in doing something in the CPS. And the CPS, aside from just doing the general crime, which you found, which you will start out in, by the way, we also have specialist departments, and that is counter-terrorism, organised crime, special crime, and that's gross negligence, manslaughter, misconduct in public office, corporate gross neg, which is complicated but super interesting, extradition. We have an international department which sends people abroad to represent us abroad, which is also, I mean, that's a whole different kettle of fish if you get sent to Iraq, but I mean, good times. And that's what I spent 6 months doing. I also got to spend 4 months in chambers because we arranged for secondments. I spent 4 months with 5KBW. 4 weeks. I spent 4 weeks in Treasury Council's room at the Old Bailey, just following Senior Treasury Council around, learning about murders. So as a pupillage goes, if you're interested in crime, you can do a lot worse than the CPS. There are a lot of different paths in the CPS as well. Once you are in, you can be a Crown Advocate. The scheme for being a Crown Advocate, it's a little bit different, but it's opened up in the CPS again. It's been closed for a while, which means that you can both be in-house as well as in the Crown Court. As a pupil, you will start out in the Mags Court, except that now, whether or not you're in chambers or not, you will be doing lists, you will be doing shoplifting, you'll be doing all of that. But it's also some of the best experience you can have ever. Irrespective of what you want to do later, it teaches you how to deal with pressure, definitely stress. You will definitely learn to deal with stress if you haven't gotten it already. And you deal with people. And that's one of the things that I love about the criminal law, is the fact that this is all about people, their lives, their stories, etc., and how your actions are going to impact on them. And for the being a Crown prosecutor specifically, or if you are instructed on our behalf, obviously, it is not about winning a case, it is about being a fair prosecutor. You follow the code for Crown prosecutors, you run the cases fairly and as properly as you can. And that is quite a responsibility. And you get that after 6 months. You are there standing in court, you have to make a decision on the evidence, on disclosure, whether or not the case goes ahead. Which witnesses are you going to call? Who are you going to summons? How are you going to talk to your victims and witnesses at court? So it entails significant amount of responsibility, and you're going to have endless sleepless nights, but God, is it fun. Like in a weird way, only if you like that kind of stuff. But But in terms of pupillage and your first 6 and your second 6, it is pretty great. I'm sorry, I started talking about the different career paths. You can go the advocates route within the CPS. You can go specialist prosecutor, which means that you might do some advocacy, but you're also usually in one of the specialist units. So amongst my group who started, there was an intake of 15 in 2012, half of us barristers, half of us solicitors. And one of them's ended up who's a district crown prosecutor, which means he's in charge of a team of 20, I think, if not 30 other lawyers, business admin, etc. Another one works for counter-terrorism, specialist prosecutor. Another one, after 5 years and having spent some time in extradition, went to the self-employed bar and now has an extradition practice, because it's one of the few areas that you can actually get significant amount of extradition experience. And that's different paths. For me, I ended up becoming a domestic, we call it domestic abuse now, sorry, not domestic violence, we changed, domestic abuse specialist. I worked a lot in the youth court, and in the CPS you get to do youth cases, quite serious ones early on if you do the training and you follow that path. I then went on to do a year in extradition, and that means you're standing up and representing on behalf of other jurisdictions. So the day you stand up and say, I appear on behalf of the Russian Federation, is a kind of, it's a milestone in your life, professionally. I then went on to work as a specialist prosecutor for the private office in the CPS. And that meant I worked directly on the Director of Public Prosecution's legal team. I did that for the last 2 and a bit years, which meant you got to see everything that went on. You got to work with the Attorney General's office, with the Home Office. You sat on cross-governmental working groups. Nothing I had ever thought I could do when I was sitting where you are now. Absolutely not. But they gave the opportunity because they wanted someone who was a little bit more junior and had a different perspective, and that was fantastic. The things I've learnt, and the things I've learnt not to do, which is equally important, I think. And following that, I am now a prosecutor on the homicide team. So I now get to deal with the many, many murders that London is currently having, which is great. You know what I mean, great. It's interesting. So I suppose what I'm trying to say about the CPS is it has a lot of different opportunities. You can go different ways. If you want to do more advocacy, do more advocacy, but you also realise that there are different types of advocacy, which I think Michael will absolutely have experience of. Trying to persuade a minister to do what you think they should be doing, trying to persuade colleagues, trying to persuade witnesses or explain things to witnesses sometimes. They're different skills, and at the bar, or depending on your path, you'll learn them all and use them, hopefully, to the best of your ability. But yeah, so if you have any questions afterwards, obviously, ask me as much as you can. Mainly crime, though, I'm afraid.
I've probably got a slightly kind of different path from my colleagues here. I think what I would say straight off before I go into my blurb is what I've definitely learnt in at my time at the bar is take any opportunity that comes to you, whether you think it's appropriate for you or not. If it even vaguely intrigues you, take it, because if I had not done that, I would not be here right now speaking to you. I started having finished my bar course as a paralegal, kind of flitting around, working mostly for criminal solicitors, doing what used to be called outdoor clerking. I'm not sure if it still technically exists, but that was a really good experience. And now I am a barrister at the Financial Conduct Authority, working in their law and policy team. Just to give maybe a bit of background about the FCA, I don't know how much you guys know about them. We're one of the financial regulators within the UK. Any bank, any provider of a financial service will normally have on their blurb or on their material authorised by the Financial Conduct Authority and maybe one of the other ones. We're probably best known currently for those brilliant Arnold Schwarzenegger adverts with the head on that goes around telling you about PPI. By the way, if you want to make a claim, 29th of August 2019 is the deadline, so I'm going to stress that again. if anyone had asked me 12 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, whether this is where I would think I would be, I probably wouldn't. I'd be quite surprised, hopefully pleasantly surprised, but certainly surprised. What I'll do is I'll talk a little bit about how I got to where I currently am, and a little bit about what I do, a little bit of what I've done as a pupil, which I did within the FCA, and then just a little bit more about a little bit of advice as well. So after flitting around as a paralegal for a bit, working mostly doing criminal matters, sitting in on interesting cases involving defrauding the Bank of England, I learned a little bit more about what was then called the FSA, the Financial Services Authority. Didn't really know who they were. Sounded quite interesting. I thought, oh, they've probably got some paralegal jobs there. Let me apply there and see what happens. So I applied, got interviewed, joined their enforcement division, which is, to describe it, I think the best way to describe it is almost like a policing and CPS division merged into one. So we have a number of case teams who investigate potential misconduct, looking into whether a bank or a financial advisor or anyone providing a financial service, including garages, have breached any of our rules, and then looking at whether on the basis of that we want to take action. And then we have the more legal element, the kind of more CPS, more prosecutor element, where we may take administrative action against a firm or individual. We might take civil action, and we can also prosecute, normally in conjunction with the CPS.
Always good times.
Always good times. And as we've had some quite interesting cases that have come out from there, now that we've got our own kind of prosecutions team. So I joined initially a case team as a paralegal, getting an idea, firstly, what does the financial regulator do, which is quite interesting. Also, how do they investigate and look into matters? I got to do very interesting things like do search warrants. I got to do a search warrant. That was quite interesting, especially when the individual wasn't convinced that we had the power to do so, and we politely told them we did. I've been able to interview potential subjects of investigation to obtain information about what they may or may not have done. I've had the opportunity to really analyse and go through information, and occasionally I got the opportunity to analyse and give advice on very tiny pieces. While I was there, I worked for a number of different departments, getting more of an idea of what the FCA does, what the FSA at the time does, and my manager said, "Would you consider applying for pupillage within the FSA?" And I thought that opportunity had flown away, but yes, I'll apply, and I started pupillage in 2012. It involved 6 months in at Chambers. So I went to Chambers that did mostly insolvency work. So the first couple of weeks I was there, I was mostly involved observing winding up petitions, which were very interesting. I got to see a good chunk of advocacy, and also getting to see some other insolvency work while I was there, a bit of commercial. And then I returned back to what was then the FCA to do the rest of my 6 months working in what's called the litigation and legal review team. So effectively the team that will look at a case that a case team puts together and advise them on litigation risk, on strategy going forward, that sort of thing. And actually I found that really interesting and a lot wider than I ever thought it would be. I got to use a lot more skills and investigate a lot more fields than I thought I would. Occasionally you would be looking into things like kind of divorce law, because you'd have an individual who was the subject of where we were taking confiscation proceedings against, who was conveniently divorcing, and therefore there was issues about how much of the money that may be ill-gotten gains may go to the wife. Occasionally there'd be some housing law involved, because someone was dealing in what's called sale and rent back, and had taken all these properties off individuals, and then looking at how we can assist whether we needed to send someone to court in regards to that to put orders in place to prevent those properties being dissipated. I was able to form my own kind of niche area of what's called upper tribunal proceedings. So mostly when we decide to take administrative action, so banning an individual or imposing a fine against an individual or firm, they can appeal that to the upper tribunal, tax and chancery. So slightly different beast from civil courts. Most of my work was involving preparing for substantive hearings that would go before the tribunal. That's probably some of the most interesting work I got to do, because I got to take ownership effectively of a case, advising the case team, what steps do we take now given that this is what this person wants to do. In particular, it involved having to negotiate with an external barrister who was representing the other side, dead into the night about terms of agreeing a settlement, because his client, having wasted our time for several months, decided, actually, I don't really want to take this to the tribunal anymore now that I see that you've got sufficient evidence to really do me in. I was there for a couple of years, developing kind of litigation. Got myself what's called a kind of like a litigation ticket. So I became authorised to conduct litigation, which is something quite unusual for barristers to do, but something that's quite, I think, common among the employed bar. So that's, I think, what makes us quite unique. I've now moved into more policy work. So we ensure that enforcement has the appropriate powers and policies in place to do their job effectively. So that's meant that I've been involved a lot of liaising with different departments within the FCA about what we can and can't do, and more interesting, more governmental work. So a lot more liaising with, for example, the Treasury over statutory instruments that they put in place to implement EU guidance. And strangely enough, as you might imagine, an awful lot of work on Brexit. Yes, you saw that one coming. So really what I would say is that in the past 5 or 6 years, I've had the opportunity to get quite a lot of interesting work in, because effectively I decided I would take a chance and apply for a job that I didn't really know loads about, but looked quite interesting, assuming that I would never qualify as a barrister, and then ultimately did. So I would go back to the point I made at the beginning, is that you should look at any opportunities that come across to you. There are benefits to both the self-employed and employed bar. You can move in and out relatively easily. Of the pupils that I joined with, some of us have remained with the FCA, some of us have gone to solicitors' firms, some of us have gone back into private practice. So there are opportunities, don't discount anything. I'll give very little about opportunities within the FCA, mainly because unfortunately FCA pupilages are only available to people within the FCA who've been there for a small period of time. So I don't want to give too much of a promise regarding that, but certainly if financial regulation is a field that you're interested in, definitely consider, for example, secondments or work experience within the FCA. Currently, I work with a number of seconded barristers, which has been really great. I get to hear a bit about what's going on in the self-employed bar, and they get to hear a bit more about how financial regulation works. So, yeah, sorry, I've kind of bladdered on there, but yeah.